Welcome back to Western Synergy. My name's Nathan Johnson, and today I'm joined by Dr. Willemijn Appels. I appreciate you taking the time to join us here on Western Synergy. Would you mind maybe talking to the audience a little bit about what you do here?
Yeah, so I'm a senior research chair, and I lead our applied research work in irrigation science. We're funded by an endowment by the Mueller family, which was made almost 10 years ago now, to support local questions that might be raised by farmers, by irrigators on how to use water in agriculture. So I'm a hydrologist by training, and I originate from a wet country, so I used to be in drainage and groundwater movement, and but mostly in the spatial variability of it. And then sort of when I got pointed into this direction of irrigation, then I realized that it's the same thing, it's just the input and not the output.
Can you describe a little more general of what spatial variability on moisture in soil is?
Well, yeah. So when you drive through Southern Alberta, you'll see these enormous, large agricultural fields, right? It's a quarter of a mile squared is the typical field size. So it's 800 meters by 800 meters. Now within that, it's very unlikely that you have one soil type and only one elevation, let's say. So within a field, there's usually some kind of variation. There might be a little hill, there might be a little dip. There's a clay layer here, there's some sandy patches there may be some salt. And all that affects how plants grow and how water moves through the landscape.
Okay.
And so when you apply water to plants, you might want to take that into account, especially if you want to use water in the most effective way possible.
So how did you get started specifically in this? Can we back the story up to maybe younger Willemijn? How did you get into this adventure?
Well, that's a tricky one because younger Willemijn did not like irrigation all that much. He thought it was extremely boring. When I went to university, that was definitely not what I had in mind. But I was interested in water because it's a thing that we all need. We all depend on it, whether you use it to flush your toilet or to grow a crop or to drink, to shower, whatever. And everyone has an opinion on it, on how we should use it, how much we should leave in the river if water flowing to the sea is wasted, or if it's actually useful for ecosystems or people who look at water and like it. But so yeah, I was interested in water as a thing, as an issue, and that's what I studied. And then the beauty of it is that there's so many aspects to hydrology that you can sort of meander through different topics in your career. And I started off in agriculture, but in as I said, in drainage and groundwater issues, and then moved to Canada with the intention to stay here for a couple of years and learn more about snow and snowmelt and hydrology of sort of colder places. I ended up in Southern Alberta, and that happens to be the spot where irrigation is really, really important.
I think Alberta is considered a dry land?
Yeah, so Southern Alberta in particular is semi-arid.
Okay.
We're in the middle of what's called Palliser's Triangle. So there's more evaporation during the year than we get rainfall or snowmelt. So in order, at some point in an average year, at some point you will be at a phase where there's not enough water to sustain optimal crop growth. It doesn't mean that you can't grow anything. It just means that, grasses turn brown or wheat starts ripening. So having the ability to keep on adding water while the plant could still grow a little bit more is really advantageous if you want to grow a good crop. But yeah, in climates just east of us, Manitoba and onwards, you don't necessarily need that because you get enough rainfall to compensate the evapotranspiration that the plants put out.
Where does it kind of start that irrigation almost becomes like a bit of a necessity? Is it that in Saskatchewan area?
Yeah, and in Quebec, Ontario, and in Manitoba as well, you have periods in the summer where you have a deficit. So people might supplement with sprinklers in July or in August. And specifically for high value crops, that's still a really good add-on. But then yes, in Saskatchewan and in Alberta, interior of BC, that's definitely where you see big differences if you grow the same crop under dryland conditions than when you grow them under irrigated conditions.
What are kind of more of the, let's say the societal impacts that you guys are affecting? Because I don't think you're studying them. You're more studying specifically the soil moisture. But do you know kind of like how what you're doing affects the end users, which potentially would be our audience?
What we really want to achieve is that we use as much of the water that we take out of the river system. So for irrigation, at some point, you'll have to withdraw water either from a reservoir or from a river. By taking that water and bringing it from that river or from that reservoir to a farmer's field, in between that, there's a lot of opportunity for it to get lost. And then if you apply it on a field, there's even more, or there's subsequently more opportunities for it to get wasted, essentially. And I think everyone in sort of the chain of getting water from river to a farmer's field is always looking for ways to make sure that we minimize those losses. And we hope to contribute to that by providing sort of numbers on what it is that you can do, or how could you optimize the timing or the location or the way with which you supply water in order to minimize those losses on farmers' fields.
Would you be able to maybe just kind of walk us through what typically it would look like to do this research in like a field or something, like just like a basic walkthrough of kind of what you guys are doing that would be, at a higher level?
Yeah, so we have, I think we could split up what we do in sort of three areas. One is irrigation technology. So the sprinklers with which you apply water, you can optimize those such that they spray a certain type of droplet, or they are placed at a different elevation above the ground surface so that you don't lose water through the wind or to evaporation. Or you could change to a whole different technology altogether and use, for instance, drip irrigation, with which you put lines either on the surface or below the surface in the ground to make sure that you don't add water that then keeps on hanging in the plant canopy, in the leaves and on the stems and everything. So that's sort of the technology side of things.
So you test, and you would work with other irrigation partnerships and things like that to just test the different types to see which one's the most optimal.
Yeah, and so because we're an applied research group, so it is actually possible for retailers or someone who has built a new nozzle to reach out to us and say, hey, I have something new. I think it works better than the old stuff. Can you test it? And we can do that. We have a research farm near the city of Lethbridge where we can run sort of side-by-side comparisons and do randomized tests and everything. And then the second part is the management aspect of it. So deciding on when and how much to water. And that's a really big thing, because in the end, you can have let's say you have a drip irrigation system, which is super efficient. It loses, let's say that 0% of the water that you apply gets lost because it all gets dripped in very nicely into the soil. If you just open the tap for that and you leave it running for the entire season, you're still wasting water because you haven't put any thought into when does the plant need water? How much does it need? Is there rainfall that we can sort of rely on in a particular week or a particular month? The technology itself needs to be managed properly in order to get those savings.
And right now, the things you were describing, like if whether it rained or how much water is needed, that is all handled currently by the farmer that's responsible for that plot of land and running that irrigation system.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
And is that process like mostly manual, or is there like computers, or is there some other stuff in there that currently exists today that helps with that stuff?
Traditionally, you go out into a field, you dig up a hole, or you auger a smaller hole into the ground to different depths, so to sort of to the entire depth of your root system, and then you assess by hand how much water is in the soil. And that's a process that works very well if you have a lot of experience and if you know your land well. You can make an educated guess as to how much water is present. Based on how it feels in your hand and sort of what the staining pattern looks like, you can determine whether or not the plant will be stressed. And you can learn it, you can document it. There's sort of standardized ways of doing it, but it's a method that varies per person. You can replace that by using sensors, for instance, that you either take with you, and you do the same thing. You dig a hole, you stick it in, you read out the number. That means that 10 different people can get the same number out of that same sensor rather than 10 different readings with their hands. And then you can take one of those two methods or one of those two assessments and determine, okay, well, this means that I'm going to turn on my pivot in 2 days from now and I'm going to irrigate, let's say, 1/2 inch or maybe 3/4 of an inch if it's dry. Then sort of a step beyond that would be to install sensors more permanently into the ground. So you could keep track of what the dynamics are of how much water is present in your root zone. There's a lot of commercial options for that available. And some of those will also be connected to a bit of a forecast model or historic weather data and historic sort of patterns of plant water use, and then give suggestions on, okay, well, you should be irrigating this and this much on that and that day.
How many like sensors are they actually like say I bought a commercial solution today, would I be putting in like one sensor in the center of the field, or would I be like, because you were mentioning that fields can make up of different things, would I be placing like a bunch of sensors?
Well, so that's sort of the key question there. Typically, you're willing to put in money for one or two. But if you have a highly variable field, you probably need to look into more sensors. Or you might want to consider, well, we'll put one in a location where we know we usually are in trouble midway or sort of 3/4 into the season, to use it as a sort of a warning. But there's no consensus really on what's the best way of doing that. So there's a lot of trial and error involved. And that's where these solutions aren't always great, because one sensor in one field, we know it's not quite enough. But what kind of information should you be taking from that? And how can you integrate that with other ways of collecting data or collecting information about your field and about your crop? The best thing would be something spatial, so drones and whatnot. Everyone thinks that or hopes that there's a solution in that. But the problem with most remote sensing and drone cameras, etc., is that they can only see the plant or maybe the very top layer of the soil. So yeah, if there's moisture anywhere deeper than 0.5 meter, knowing how much is there or how it's behaving is difficult. The third part is sort of filling in that blank, mostly computer and lab based. So we really try to understand the system of water flow through a field, as well as sort of how plants use that water and when they use that water, and then see if we can tie the two together with observations. So if we know that you need, let's say, a rainfall event of 50 millimeters or more to generate a puddle in some kind of low spot in the field, if we know that, then maybe we don't have to put 10 sensors out there. Maybe we can say 2 and a rain gauge. And if we hit that switch, then we know, okay, now you've got to pay attention to this particular area. Or now you might want to shut off irrigation in that part of the field.
And so you guys are focusing mainly on, like, are you hoping to create a better sensor set or a better system or better understanding? Like, is it all of it together?
A little bit of everything. But I think ultimately where we provide, or where we can add most to what producers are already doing, is to sort of really figure out how can you use existing tools. And if you buy sensor X, then what other questions should you be asking, or how can you interpret what comes out of that sensor in your decision-making process? So
in your adventures on doing this, what's kind of been sort of maybe the top 2 eye-opening moments for working in the, I guess this is considered ag tech?
I guess so, yeah.
Ag tech, ag science?
Ag science. Water is a bit of the environmental science of agriculture. Okay. So it's, yes, it contributes to yield, but there's a bit of a margin in there. So saving water, you want to save water a little bit, but not too much, because then you don't have enough yield.
In this sector of what the research you're doing, what's kind of been maybe describe an eye-opening moment for you where you kind of like learned something that you didn't think you would, or something that like was quite interesting?
Looking back, I'm thinking like, oh, this should be a no-brainer for anyone working in agriculture. But water and say nutrients are so connected that it's sometimes really difficult to separate the effects of one or the other. And especially that's especially an issue because we do a lot of observational work. So sometimes you see researchers only doing these small little plot trials, right? And they can say, okay, well, treatment A is better than treatment B. What we often end up doing is being in a large field, instrumenting it, getting as much information as we can on how a farmer is managing it, or how our farm manager is managing this particular piece of land, and then trying to explain how the processes sort of work together to result in differences or uniformity of plant growth. Going into it, I thought that water was the main thing. But the relationship with nutrients is often so intricate that it's really difficult to separate the two out. And so when you think about, okay, well, Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada found something, and that should lead to water savings of 10 millimeters over the season, then being able to achieve those water savings in the real world are sometimes a really big issue because things don't line up in the field as they did in that plot. And so that's been really interesting for me, because the things that I thought would work may not have worked just because they don't scale as well.
As you guys march forward with this, is the hope to provide, I'll just use farmers as an example. Is it the hope to provide farmers with information or like a technology or like a system? Like, is there a specific kind of goal that you guys have?
Not one. I would say just to help farmers figure out what works best for them, and then for the sector as a whole to make sure that we can reduce the amount of water that we use per field, and really make use of water as efficiently as we possibly can.
So if right now, knowing what you know, obviously having access to probably, like I would say, more cutting edge understanding of this science, especially in the irrigation world, as like if you were a farmer, what would kind of be the top maybe 2 or 3 things that you would focus on to get improvement or benefit from the research you're doing?
I would pick 1 or 2 sensors and get to know those well over a number of years. I know from experience now that can be a really kind of a frustrating process, because you don't quite see what you expect to see, or often in the first year. It might not be as important to have the most precise, most accurate, most up-to-date tech. It is important to have a piece of equipment that's reliable, gives you information high frequency, and that you can install at a location where you're really interested in, so that you can learn. It's basically like farming. You get to learn your fields as a farmer from kid onwards. This is just another way of using tech to get to know how your field works and how your crop works. And so that can be a soil moisture sensor, but that can also be a drone. Learn to recognize what does a particular sort of blot on your image. That might be that water that comes near the surface, or that might be the crop responding to nutrient stress. But if you get to know that type of information, I think there are so many cool ways in which you get to learn more about the systems that you're working with. And that, as a farmer, I would be interested in that.
After going through and spending time doing this stuff over your career, what's kind of the biggest challenge you've faced? Maybe, and like that's obviously like a very global subject, because it sounds like you've worked in a lot of different environments of water, but maybe for our Western Canada listeners, like what's the big challenge that you faced in doing this research, or making the progress that you would like to? Like, it sounds like you're making amazing progress, but we all face challenges. What would be something that you faced that was a kind of maybe not a red flag, but just something that popped up that would be interesting to share with our audience?
One thing that we've found out, and that a lot of farmers have also found out in the last couple of years, is that, let's say, the irrigation tech is being built as you can now control each sprinkler on your pivot. So that's the round sprayers that you see in Southern Alberta fields. Those things are not very reliable. And whether the market is too small or whether it is more difficult than we give the companies credit for, it seems surprising that after this tech having been on the market for more than a decade, you can't always rely on it to do what you want it to do.
There's always a difference between what you say you're going to do or can do in theory, because it's like the ideas are usually very simple, right? Like I would guess with controlling the output of an irrigation pivot, you put a valve on it and then the valve regulates the water flow. But in practice, there's just so many factors that when you go to do something in reality is that, from one farm to the next farm, to the next farm, to the next pivot, to the next pivot, to the next pivot, there's just so many different factors that would control whether or not that's actually doable. And I'm guessing that's where that comes from.
Sometimes it's a little discouraging because you could theoretically have these water savings or increases in efficiency. But when you look at, okay, well, what's the error margin of what I'm doing right now, even in the most baseline scenario? If that's 10, 20%, then your water savings might be negligible because you lost already 5 or 7% just by turning the thing on. So there's some room for improvement there for sure.
So if you could wish some type of solution in for helping people with water usage, like, so if you could just magically wand in something that works, is there any type of like device or sensor or system or, knowledge that you would want to have magically available?
Well, that would be the photo camera for moisture underground. Some kind of sensing machine with which you could accurately map how much water is present in the soil. So not above the soil, but in the soil column in the entire root zone, from the surface right to 1.2 meters deep.
Okay, and so when you say like a camera system, would this be something that like it's sitting above using some type of sensor, or it'd be something that travels in and out of the dirt?
It would be something that wouldn't have to go into the dirt,
okay,
but really go on top. So either you mount it to a drone, or you hold it in your hands, or you mount it on a stick or on the pivot. Remote sensing satellites that we have up in the air or in space, with which you can map, for instance, the biomass of plants. Now, all those things, they don't penetrate very deeply, and we've recently, for the last 3 years, we've worked with a company that builds a sensor that has some penetration capacity that goes a little bit deeper to 30, 40 centimeters maybe. But that's still only 30 to 40 centimeters.
And you're trying to get to 100 centimeters, you said, right?
Ideally,
yeah, okay.
Let's say 4 feet.
Okay,
yeah.
4 feet, okay.
3 to 4 feet would be fantastic. And the techniques that exist at the moment it works, but it's very noisy. So you want something, in order to make it really helpful for irrigation, you want something that's just super accurate, high resolution. It's easy to fly around and no hole digging involved. Mm-hmm. If we could build that, that'd be fantastic.
Is that like a year or two, 5, 10 year away type thing, or is it like a possibility?
It might be a possibility. It would have to be a combination of things, because I don't think you can design anything that will penetrate the soil to a meter depth with the accuracy that we need for irrigation management.
Also, without it being really radioactive.
There's that. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, there are pieces that contribute to that goal. Mm-hmm. Those exist, but you have, tying them all together into something that you could actually use. I think that's at least 5 years away.
Yeah, I always love asking people this type of question, because it's sort of cool to look into the future. And one thing that I like to do is that sometimes there's an existing solution that has like a great impact. So like a lot of times when we talk about, what's the future solution? And that's the solution that gets to that, like, the 80, 90 to 100% of the way, where we're getting into that, like it's telling you what's really going on. Is there solutions that are, say, that like 70% solution that are cost effective and available today? Like something that you would like if a farmer came to you and said, hey, I want to start this process. Is there a solution that exists today that is, kind of the all-rounded, cost-effective, easy to set up, quick to get going, or is that still okay?
No. If you want the most reliable system and the one that goes to the depth and in the space that you want, you hire an army of little people and you give them all a Dutch auger and you drill some holes and ask them to squeeze that soil.
Okay.
There's multiple ways of sort of tackling aspects of that problem, and I think there's different industries and researchers and farmers who make real good progress towards sort of getting that to a place where you can say, okay, I want this piece and I want that piece, and I can build that from what's available on the market.
So what would you say on a percentage out of like, say all the farms that you've dealt with, what's the percentage of farmers that are currently acting upon this right now, where they're measuring their field for water levels and stuff like that, with more of like with the auger and and maybe the basic, you said, I think a soil moisture sensor and a rain sensor?
100% of the people does some kind of measurement. I'm going to say 50 or 60% uses a sensor, but that might be off. Everyone's got access to a drone or some aerial imagery to look at their fields, and I think everyone has a pretty good understanding, even if it's from walking or driving a field, of where your water goes, as up to like really keeping track and evaluating at the end of the season, okay, so how did water move through my root zone? That might be a little bit less. Even people with sensors probably mostly use it during the season to say, okay, I see that the curve is going down, it's going down steeply, I should irrigate now.
So based on everything that you're doing, what are you trying to kind of like what's the main thing that you're trying to accomplish over the next like year or two here at the Polytechnic with your research? Like what would you hope would be kind of the outcome you're targeting?
We're preparing a project in which we hope to integrate some of the data collection with forecasting models and water balance models that we've developed in the last couple of years. And we want to put a bit of a price tag on and maybe a time tag on different types of solutions. So if you use this tool and a model, how much effort or how much time do you have to spend working it, looking at it, evaluating it, and how will it benefit your irrigation decision? That's one that we really look forward to, because at the end of the day, you want a sensor or something that you buy to provide a return on investment. And that can be in water savings, or it can be in ease of operation, or in making your decision-making process faster. And we hope to try to be a bit more quantitative about that. For the moment, it's mostly like, well, this one was a pain to install, or the portal wasn't easy to look at, or it was confusing. But to formalize that assessment a little bit, and also then combine it with scenario analysis. If you use this information to make a decision, will you save water, or will you lose water, or will you lose yield at the end of the season? So combine those two approaches and be able to work with actual irrigators on saying, okay, we think that for the questions that you ask during the season, this solution works best.
What is it like the goal that you really are strongly behind, or your principles for doing this?
The real interesting part is where water becomes scarce and where water becomes a resource that is limited. And we have that here. So in sort of the broader sense, our farmers here are part of the South Saskatchewan River Basin, which can be subdivided in the Bow River Basin and the Oldman River Basin as you move further towards the mountains. And those rivers are fed by snowmelt from the Rockies. Every year, every winter, hopefully that snowpack builds up and melts and feeds those rivers. And we capture a bit of it along the way in reservoirs, the Waterston Dam, the St. Mary's Dam, the Oldman Dam. But there are also a lot of people in this river basin who live here, who work here, who have other industries. And the water pattern in the rivers is very seasonal. So it peaks in June, then it drops off, and in August, a bunch of our rivers run dry or very low. Everyone got a piece through a water licensing system. And those pieces were given out up to 100 years ago. And now we've given out so many pieces that there are years in which not everyone can get the full amount that they would like. And figuring out how we can then manage how people can access water, or how we can secure that people can drink before we irrigate plants, for instance. That's a really interesting sort of conversation to see. And that played out quite a bit in the last couple of years because we had such dry summers and also dry winters. So reservoir levels were low. There was no snowpack. There was no real rain in the forecast. What do we do? And there's a lot of focus on irrigation in those periods because the irrigation districts are the largest license holders. They could withdraw the most water from the river system, specifically in the Oldman River, but also in the Bow, because of the way our system is organized, because they also hold older licenses or senior licenses. Technically, they could say, okay, well, we get our water first, and then everyone else gets theirs. And if there's none left, too bad. That's not how it goes in the end, because people do talk to each other, and the government had facilitated negotiations to address, okay, how are we going to manage this drought? And the irrigation districts restrict, in years of drought, they restrict how much their users can get. So it's not a free-for-all. But that whole process it's contentious. There's a lot of public scrutiny because people are rightly asking, well, what about us? How can we share this? Why do they get such a large amount of water? A lot of people don't really realize how much progress we've made in the last 50 years in using water wisely and in making sure that we stay within limits of what is available. Irrigators do know that there's a drought going on. They're very aware of that, and they'll tailor and adjust accordingly. And that's a process that people put a lot of thought in and a lot of effort and also spend quite a bit of money on making that as efficient as possible and make sure that we have enough water for everyone.
It's been just unbelievably fascinating, and I'm super happy to know that you're here doing this type of work because, I think everyone at this point understands how critical all of this is to our existence as a whole.
I hope people learn something about irrigation and that it's some food for thought for future considerations about water and how we use it or how others might use it.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much, Willemijn. My name's Nathan Johnson. Thank you so much for joining us again on Western Synergy, and I hope you'll join me next time.